counteroffensive launched by the Ukrainian forces earlier this month has been the darkest nightmare for the Russian forces. Russian forces were lurking in the areas they had temporarily occupied before the heavy attacks of the Ukrainians began. Especially in the direction of Kharkiv, the Russians easily took control of the strategic parts of Kharkiv due to the withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces in the region immediately after the start of the war. Russian soldiers in the temporarily occupied territories did not expect such a counterattack by the Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian forces did not lose only temporarily captured lands in the Kharkiv region. At the same time, it lost a lot of military manpower and military equipment, largely losing its offensive power, which has been decreasing day by day since the beginning of the war. Russian forces did not know what to do in the face of the unexpected Ukrainian attack. The Kharkiv counteroffensive by the Ukrainian warriors was so strong that the Russian high commanders fled first. Russian forces lost control of a large area as a result of Ukrainian counterattacks. Russian soldiers, completely exhausted in terms of morale and motivation with the start of the Ukrainian attacks, the only thought of the Russian soldiers was to save their own lives. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were forced to flee to Russia, and it was reported by the Ukrainian General Staff that at least 4,000 Russian soldiers were killed in the Ukrainian offensive and more than 1,200 were taken prisoner. Russian soldiers had to be faster than the Ukrainians to save their lives in the face of the rapidly arriving Ukrainian forces. For this reason, the Russians began to flee, leaving behind all the military equipment embezzled by them. The Russians left behind not only military equipment, but also military vehicles that they used to avoid attention. His eyes saw nothing as the Russian army fled. In addition, the loss of communication with the General Command Center of the Russian army is another major reason why the Russians abandoned their military vehicles. Fleeing Russian soldiers will soon realize that leaving military vehicles and equipment behind is a very wrong behavior. Ukrainian authorities underline that hundreds of Russian tanks were seized as part of the counterattack in the Kharkiv region. During the Kharkiv counteroffensive in September, Ukrainian forces reportedly captured around 200 Russian tanks. In addition, close to 700 Russian armored vehicles were destroyed or captured. This is almost half of the tanks that Ukraine has captured from the Russian army so far. Open-source researchers Oryx have calculated that more than 380 Russian tanks have fallen into Ukrainian hands since the war began. Now let's talk about the legendary and miraculous results of the Kharkiv offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces. In total, more than 4,000 Russian soldiers were destroyed. Most of the nearly 200 Russian tanks and most of the 700 Russian armored vehicles were captured. There are 93 tanks in the 1-tank brigade in the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Each brigade consists of 3 tank battalions with 31 tanks. In the Russian army, a battalion tactical group consists of 10 tanks and about 40 armored vehicles and 600 to 800 soldiers. Now we can say that the loss of the Russian army in Kharkiv in just 10 days was the entire 2 Russian tank brigade, or the entire 6 Russian tank battalion. Or if we consider all the troop losses, at least the entire 6 battalion tactical group was lost. This is a huge number, and many of the tanks and armored vehicles that Russia lost were captured in good condition. This meant that the Ukrainian armed forces had a new tank regiment of the Free Russian tanks. Currently, the Ukrainian fighters are making new gains in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, with the new equipment they captured from the Russian army. According to Igor Levchenko, the head of strategic modeling at New Geopolitics, a Kiev-based think tank, Ukraine captured around 100 Russian tanks that were not destroyed during the Kharkiv offensive. Igor Levchenko stressed that many of the captured Russian tanks will be ready for battle immediately, since the main reason that the Russians abandoned the tanks rather than using them to escape is that they did not start, and most of them will probably be easily repaired and will be put into service immediately and used in new offensives. 100 main battle tanks is a large number, enough for a full tank brigade, Levchenko said. In some drone footage released early in the war, Russian forces were seen casually abandoning the tanks and fleeing for no apparent reason. This unacceptable behavior of soldiers in the Russian army angered the Kremlin. Presumably, these soldiers were identified and prosecuted according to Russian law. I would like to point out that we can divide the tank losses into 2 phases, before and after the Ukrainian counterattack. Before the Ukrainian counterattacks, that is, during the 6-month period of the war, the Russian forces lost many tanks. Russia did not replace the tanks it lost in the first 6 months due to the sanctions. After the Ukrainian counterattacks, the Russians lost more tanks in just 10 days than in the first 6 months. In this case, it should be noted that most of the tanks lost by the Russians before the Ukrainian counterattack became unusable. However, the lack of damage to most of the tanks lost by the Russians after the Ukrainian counterattack indicates that these tanks will be used against the Russians when they are captured by the Ukrainian forces. Among the military vehicles abandoned by the Russian forces are the operational T-72 tanks, which will further strengthen the offensive of the Ukrainian troops. Russian forces reached the border of Kiev at the beginning of the war, but the Russian army was unsuccessful and had to retreat. After this event, Ukrainian repairmen repaired the tanks that the Russians left in areas close to Kiev for various reasons, and delivered them to the Ukrainian forces. One of the mechanics commissioned by the Ukrainian forces to repair the tanks stated that they had pulled the Russian tanks out of the swamps. He also underlined that these repaired tanks were used against the Russians. Now the Ukrainian forces do not need repairmen. Russian forces left more high-quality equipment operational, replacing the damaged equipment with the Ukrainian counterattack. This is the most important proof of how serious the defeat of the Russian army was. President of Ukraine Zelensky stated that they will not allow the areas liberated from the Russian occupation to be reoccupied, and that the progress against the Russian army will continue. Before the start of the counteroffensive by the Ukrainian forces, the Kremlin government, through various conscription programs, mustered military manpower to go to the front. Due to the heavy losses of the Russians at the front, the military manpower slightly improved, but the offensive power of the Russian forces did not increase. Soldiers who went to the front with volunteer military programs were inexperienced and did not have high-level military equipment. For this reason, they could not show any effect against the Ukrainian forces. The mobilization decision announced by the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, the only difference from the voluntary military programs will be that Russia does not pay money this time. Because the fate of the Russians who went to Ukraine with the mobilization due to the limited equipment will be the same as others. Russian forces want to use equipment from the Soviet era to solve the limited equipment problem. According to the photos published on social media, Russian forces started to deploy T-62 tanks used in the Soviet Union period. As it's known, Russia has been using the railway infrastructure left from the Soviet Union since the beginning of the war to send military shipments to Ukraine. These are images showing a large number of over 50-year-old T-62 tanks lined up on the railway. A 50-year-old old school in the face of modern weapons owned by the Ukrainian army. With the declaration of mobilization, the training process of the soldiers to be sent to Ukraine was reduced to almost zero. After giving clothes and weapons in Russia, soldiers are sent directly to Ukraine. This is actually a sign that the Kremlin government sees the mobilized soldiers as cannon fodder. The Ukrainian General Staff reports that Russian forces have lost more than 2,000 tanks. The previously mentioned T-62 tanks will be used to replace lost tanks, but they will not have much protection against Stinger and other anti-tank missiles, as they are old production. For this reason, Ukrainian forces will destroy Russian tanks more quickly and Russian losses will increase more quickly. The fact that the T-62 tanks came out of the warehouse is the biggest proof of how unprepared Russia is for modern wars. The T-62 tanks were the last tanks produced in the Soviet Union between 1961 and 1973. Before the T-72 tanks were produced. The T-62 is a semi-automatic vehicle equipped with a 115mm smoothbore gun. The Kremlin did not deny this event and announced that ceremonial tanks were used due to the increased losses of Russia in Ukraine. The Russians are trying to use these tanks while they should remain a representative symbol used only in ceremonies. It's impossible for the Russians to succeed with these tanks. There is no small Ukraine in front of them. There is a Ukraine that has the support of Western countries and has many modern weapons. The Kremlin government needs to be very careful when taking its future steps. After the fast counterattack phase, the battle might feel a little more sluggish now. But this recession is not that the war will go like this. On the contrary, it's a section where it's prepared by two to reach a higher level. We hope that the Ukrainians will regain their freedom and territorial integrity as soon as possible, and the Russian people will be freed from Putin's oppression. Thanks for watching.